Starting off with the worst evolution in the game, which is going right into F tier, we got the Evolved Ice Spirit. Ever since this evolution came out, it has still remained to be the worst one. Even though it's a 2-cycle evolution now, instead of 3, which is what it was originally, it still just simply doesn't get a lot of value, and it's very situational, and the issue is there's so many other evolutions that get you so much more value inside of cycle decks that you would just much rather have instead of the Evolved Ice Spirit. Next up is the Evolved Goblin Barrel, which is also going into F tier. The issue with the Evolved Goblin Barrel is majority of the time you can tell where the juked barrel is, and there's just so many small spells in the game that deal with it really easily. On top of that, the decks that it pairs well in, like bait for example, a lot of bait players prefer to use other evolutions over the Evolved Goblin Barrel. Even though the Goblin Barrel is the win condition, most bait players prefer to run things like the Evolved Knight, the Evolved Skeletons, and the Evolved Tesla instead of it. And the last one going in F tier are the Evolved Barbarians. They used to be a lot better, but then as more evolutions got added, they've kind of gotten worse and worse, because now inside of Lava Hound, you always see Lava players prefer to run the Evolved Valkyrie and the Evolved Bomber instead of the Evolved Barbarian, so they don't really have a deck that they fit in. Also, things like the Evolved Tesla and the Evolved Wizard are just such a good counter to them, which you see very frequently in the meta. So since then, they've just become a lot worse. We'll begin C tier with the Evolved Goblin Giant. There's some situations where it can get value when he loses 50% of his health and he starts spawning goblins, but the problem is in some matchups, if you're against a card that deals splash damage, or a unit that can hit multiple things at once, then the goblins are not really doing anything. So he's very matchup dependent, and there's some times where the evolution is practically useless. Up next are the Evolved Bats. They can be good in certain decks like Mortar Bait, or inside of Giant Graveyard, you might often see them, but the issue is there's a lot of small spells that can take them out and are very effective against them. But their healing mechanic can be pretty useful for pressuring and defending, but I just think there's a lot of evolutions that are stronger than them in general. Next up are the Evolved Archers. Ever since they made them die to arrows, they have been a lot worse. Now, the Archers are still pretty good inside of things like Giant Graveyard and also an Expo, of course, but because of how prevalent the arrows are in the meta, they just simply have not been the same ever since they got that hit points nerf. In closing out C tier here with the Evolved Mortar. Of course, it is still decent. It is very good inside of Mortar Minor. Of course, Mortar Bait, there's a few different Mortar variations you can play, but the Evolved Mortar has never been the same ever since it got the hit point bonus taken away. It used to be one of the strongest evolutions in the game, and now it's basically a regular Mortar that fires a goblin that shoots slightly faster. And because of how many tanks there are in the meta, and with the new additions in the game, like the Void, for example, there are plenty of ways to counter it pretty easily overall, and you often find yourself a very difficult time getting a Mortar lock. We'll begin B tier with the Evolved Battle Ram. This card got significantly better after the Dagger Duchess got nerfed, because the Dagger Duchess was pretty much able to counter it entirely before it actually connected to the tower. But now you actually have to respond to it, making it much more difficult to defend, especially if you don't have something like an Evolved Tesla or even a building, which is why it is now an average evolution in the game and a lot better than it was before when the Dagger Duchess was meta. And there are actually 2 more examples of the Dagger Duchess nerf making evolutions a lot better. The Evolved Wall Breakers were in the same situation, where not too long ago they were one of the worst evolutions in the game, and now they're about an average evolution because it's significantly easier to get them to reach the tower now. The problem is a lot of the decks that they pair well in, like for example with Mega Knight, aren't the strongest at this point in time, but you still see them a decent amount, and they're in a much better spot than they were before. Which is also why the Royal Recruits are in B tier instead of F tier. Just like the Evolved Wall Breakers, the Evolved Royal Recruits were one of the worst evolutions. The Dagger Duchess nerf changed that completely, because now you can pressure with them very well in both lanes without the Duchess pretty much killing them all very easily, which is why you commonly see them again with the Evolved Wall Breakers. You can also run them with the Royal Hogs again if you want to, and they are definitely back and seen again, and there's a lot of top ladder players that are pretty annoyed about that, but I think they're a pretty average evolution at the moment. The Royal Giant is also going in B tier. This is an interesting one because his ability, for the most part, all it is that knockback when he's shooting. But it's honestly a little bit underrated, which is why there's so many people that use the Evolved Royal Giant. Think about it. Pretty much, if there's any ground card that you play next to the Royal Giant, it gets knocked back. So you essentially are forced to use an air card or a building, which limits your options when defending him. But with that being said, he isn't dealing any extra damage or has any extra hit points, which is why I would say he's one of the most balanced evolutions in the game. In closing out B tier, we got the Evolved Firecracker. Man, oh man, this has to be one of the most hated cards in the game, especially at mid-ladder. I do consider her to be an average evolution though, because of how prevalent the arrows are in the meta, which is such an easy way of killing her. The Void is also a fairly good counter to the Firecracker as well, which is another spell that is very good in the meta. Another flaw with the Evolved Firecracker is of course the King activation that your opponent can easily get against her, which limits the amount of decks she can be played in where you really can't afford a King activation. But she is of course very annoying if you don't have a good answer to her, and she is a very good support card, especially in decks like Hog. We're going to start off A tier with the Evolved Knight. Jeez, this card has been nerfed so many times and it has still remained to be an above average evolution. He is just so tanky and incredibly versatile as well. You can use him in just about every cycle deck you can think of, whether it's Hog Rider, Goblin Drill, Log Bait, and then sometimes you see him in more expensive decks even, like Giant Graveyard for example. Just a very versatile card, and he still gets a lot of value even after all the nerfs he has gotten. I do believe at the moment though the Evolved Valkyrie is slightly better than the Evolved Knight, especially because of how well she pairs in Lava Hound decks, which is one of the best win conditions at the moment. And not even just Lava Hound, she goes very well with the Evolved Goblin Drill as well, and you can also use her in other cycle decks if you want to. Her Tornado ability gets a lot of value, and she also has a small health bonus, which helps her get more value than the regular Valkyrie as well, and we've been seeing her a lot more recently. Next up is going to be the Evolved Goblin Drill. Now, I want to make a note, this is a tiny bit of a prediction because the balance changes did just happen, so this is subject to change. It could still be at the bottom of S tier, but it did get a nerf in the last set of balance changes where it is going to spawn one less Goblin now the second time it resurfaces, which is going to change a lot of interactions, and I think that overall is pretty significant and makes the evolution noticeably worse, which is why I do think it is going to be A tier, but I still think it is going to be incredibly strong because the fact that it respawns a couple times is so obnoxious to deal with, especially if you don't have a good counter to it in cycle. This is also another prediction. The Evolved Goblin Cage might end up being an S tier, or maybe it will actually be worse, we find out, in B tier, but my prediction, this just came out today, so it is very hard to make an exact prediction on, but my prediction is that it will be A tier because it is a one cycle evolution, which means you can play it often, and the fact that you can pull things in means it is going to be great, of course, against tanks. However, a flaw that it has, and this is the reason why I think it might not be an S tier, is because it is practically useless against air decks, and there also are effective ways to counter it. For example, you can go for spells on it, like a Lightning, a Void, or an Earthquake, so that way the evolution doesn't get very much value. But the Brawler does have 10% more health, so even if the Cage gets no value, you will still get a small boost with the Brawler, which is why I predict it is going to be a very good evolution inside of the game. We are going to start off S tier with the Evolved Bomber. I mean, geez, this card is basically like a secondary win condition. You can snipe things from across the bridge, getting a ton of damage when you can get that lineup going. Even though it's a 2-cycle evolution now, instead of 1, it has seemingly not changed much because it is incredibly versatile. You can run it inside of cycle decks, like with the Goblin Drill. You can run it inside of heavier decks because you can run it inside of Lava. You can run it inside of Giant Graveyard. There's just a lot of variety you can use this card in. So many situations where it gets a lot of value, definitely deserving of S tier. Now, this is a tiny bit of a prediction too because the balance changes just happened, but I still think the Evolved Wizard is going to be an S tier. What happened, guys, is they decided to nerf the Evolve Wizard shield, so now you can take off the Evolve Wizard shield with spells like Log and even Zap. So you would think that's going to make the Evolve Wizard a lot worse, but here's the thing. The regular wizard got a buff, a 5% health buff, which means the regular wizard isn't going to die to poison. So with a lot more people using the regular wizard, they're going to naturally want to use the Evolve Wizard if they already want to use the wizard in their deck, which means the Evolve Wizard is still going to be played a lot. And also, a lot of people use the Evolve Wizard not just for the shield, but also that massive knockback you get. Whenever a unit gets close to the wizard and takes off his shield, he knocks them back so far away, and it actually deals some damage to them as well in the process, which is another reason why he is very strong, and also why I think he will still be very broken even after the shield nerf that he got. Next is going to be the Evolve Zap. It got a pretty big nerf to the amount of damage it deals in the second and third strike, but that honestly didn't change much because in pretty much every beatdown deck, you still see the Evolve Zap getting used, especially inside of lava and balloon decks, which are very prevalent in the meta. But not just that, you commonly see it inside of Giant Graveyard, you see it inside of P.E.K.K.A as well, which has recently made a comeback, and it is just so useful in a lot of situations to have that second and third zap come in, especially on things like an Inferno Tower, an Inferno Dragon, Baity cards, and it is just very versatile in terms of the amount of situations it can be used in, not even in just the amount of decks it can be played in. A very good spell all around. And actually, guys, I'm going to backtrack a tiny bit. I realize the Evolve Skeletons need to be at the beginning of S tier around the Evolve Bomber. The Evolve Skeletons are very broken, don't get me wrong, but I don't believe they're a top 3 evolution. The Evolved Skeletons, though, because they're only 1 elixir, they're a very low-risk evolution to use, and you can get them down oftentimes multiple times throughout the match. And if your opponent doesn't have the right spell for them, they can get 10, sometimes even 20 elixir worth of value as they're just completely wiping everything out and respawning. Or if they end up getting on the tower, then you're pretty much toast if you don't have a spell for them, which I'm sure you guys have seen many times in your own games or in clips. So they're very hit or miss sometimes, but because of how many opportunities you have to get value out of them, that is why they're one of the strongest and most consistent evolutions in the game, especially because you can use them inside of cycle decks, but you also oftentimes see them inside of heavier decks too, like you can use them with the Royal Giant, for example. Lastly though, guys, we got the Evolve Tesla. It did not get a nerf in the last set of balance changes. A lot of people were talking about what they think the best evolution is. Some people were saying it's the Evolve Goblin Drill. Others were saying it was the Evolve Wizard. Some, though, were saying it's the Evolve Tesla. And the Evolve Tesla was the only one out of the 3 that survived a nerf in the last set of balance changes, which means it is not any worse. And it was already a top 3 evolution. When you have an Evolve Tesla down, you pretty much are able to defend any push coming your way. That stun you are getting is just so valuable, and you oftentimes are getting multiple stuns in the same push because you're taking out one unit, and then once it dies, if there's something that's out of range as it's approaching, it respawns and gets that stun again. And that reset is so good against things like Sparky or other things that need to charge up and attack again. And also when it dies, you get an additional stun, which is on top of it already being broken. I feel like the thing that makes it even more broken and so amazing on defense, which is why you commonly see it in a lot of different cycle decks. Of course, it pairs very well with the Goblin Drill. You can also use it inside of Hog, though, and you can also use it inside of some other things. It fits well in a good amount of decks. Well, that's going to be it for the video. If you guys enjoyed the list, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. You can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game, and be sure to let me know in the comments below what you guys would change about my ranking. And thanks again until next time, guys.